Good morning, everyone. This is our monthly call for July 8th for FFLGuard for our California friends. We have a few people here and we're going to do this as quickly as possible so everybody can move on to life. Matt, we're going to let you get started. Here you go.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us this morning. Obviously, this is our first meeting since July 1st. And of course, the thing that's on every retailer's mind is the new firearms and ammunition excise tax, which has now taken effect. You as retailers, of course, are not going to be actually paying the tax to the CDTFA until the end of the quarter, which I believe is October. But nevertheless, you're going to have to start sort of accounting for that. And so there's a couple things that I want to sort of make sure everyone understands. First and foremost is that if you haven't already, please check out the CDTFA's website, which I posted a link in the chat. And so just to make sure that if you guys have not already seen that, there is a page there for resources that sort of goes over some basic topics of discussion, things like that, as well as some general notices, how you calculate the tax, how it applies in certain circumstances. Basically, the best source of information right now is the CDTFA's website. There are still a lot of unanswered questions, of course, and that's something that, unfortunately, I don't have an answer on a lot of that stuff, largely because there is no further regulations or clarifications that are official that I've seen posted yet, besides what is actually on the CDTFA's website. So if you guys are running into very specific issues, things like that, the only thing that I'm going to be able to tell you, at least for right now, absent further guidance, is contact the CDTFA, ask them the specific question that you have a question on, and hopefully you'll get an answer that tells you what you need to do. At the very least, you'll have some sort of official guidance from them that actually says this is whether or not it applies, how you do it, that kind of thing. When the tax first took effect, there was obviously a question regarding sales that had taken place prior to July 1st. We took the position that basically, depending on how your accounting methods and how you actually process sales, if you were able to clearly show and state that the sale took place prior to July 1st and that you had no sort of documentation or otherwise that suggested otherwise, then you would be able to potentially claim that that sale took place prior to the implementation of the tax. However, the CDTFA came out later and caused a bunch of confusion with people that said that the sale is said to have taken place at the time of delivery of the firearm. And so obviously, if for those that were selling guns prior to the July 1st deadline and that had delivery dates following the 10-day waiting period, things like that, there was a lot of questions on that. And so we still think that it's one of those things that if your documentation made that clear prior to July 1st, the sale took place, you might have an argument there with those particular guns, but you're still probably ending up down the road going to have to pay the tax and then potentially fight it, which is going to be up to each and every one of you, depending on what your particular situation is. So don't, I would say if you have specific questions on that, reach out and let us know. But the thing that I've seen for the most part is that everyone, as far as a manufacturer, retailer, et cetera, here in the state of California, generally does not have shall I say, sales contracts or other types of documentation that makes it clear that the sale took place prior to July 1st, largely because of the business accounting methods that a lot of you guys use. And so I wouldn't expect that. I should say it's possible that you might have a situation where that would have been okay, but at the same time, from what I've seen from everyone that has reached out to me on this issue, chances are you probably had some sort of contract sales terms, whatnot. Like, for example, if the gun was unable to be delivered, you had some sort of refund procedure in place or something like that. And that could suggest, for example, that the sale wasn't actually completed until the time of delivery of the firearm. And so that's the issue that we've seen. So if you still have questions on that, reach out and let us know. But the one thing that I want to make clear to everyone is that when you're actually calculating the tax and how you actually go about implementing it, it's our understanding that you can't add a line item for this new sales tax to your transactions. And so what I mean by that is currently when it comes to the general sales tax in California, you can add an additional percentage based off of the sale to the person's purchase price of the item that they're buying, and then they would end up paying that. That's not how, from our understanding, how this is actually supposed to be implemented here, because this is based off of gross receipts. And so what I mean by this is that you cannot charge the 11% tax to the customer. You have to basically incorporate that cost, so to speak, into your overall sales price of the particular item that's being sold, in this case, firearms or ammunition. And so your receipts will look like, and I posted in the chat as well, a link to a CDTFA bulletin that went out that shows how that gets calculated. But basically, let's say if you sold a $500 gun previously prior to July 1st, you now have to basically, if you want to recover the cost of the actual tax, you're going to have to raise your prices across the board to sort of account for that, as opposed to still selling the gun for $500 and then charging an extra 11% on top of the extra sales tax that goes with it to the customer directly, if that makes sense. So if you guys have questions on that, please reach out and let us know, and we'll do our best to help you. But like I said, for the most part, this has now taken effect, of course. CDTFA has posted some materials on their website that are helpful in a lot of situations, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. The CRPA has joined with a number of national organizations challenging this tax. That lawsuit was filed very recently. And so we're hoping that will, of course, result in an injunction of some type, or otherwise stop the enforcement of the tax. That remains to be seen. Of course, the issue here is that because retailers have not yet technically, quote unquote, paid the tax, we don't actually have any retailers or manufacturers as plaintiffs yet. If and when this lawsuit proceeds and the first quarter comes around and you now have retailers starting to have to pay the tax to the CDTFA, we'll probably be adding some plaintiffs to that lawsuit as well. So for those of you that are interested from a retailer standpoint to potentially be plaintiffs in that lawsuit, please reach out and let us know. And we'll reach out to you once we actually get to that point where retailers are now actually transmitting the fee for the tax to the CDTFA. Outside of that, this was the biggest issue since last month, of course, with the implementation of the tax. There's a number of lawsuits that the CRPA are still fighting, still pending. We're, shall I say, we're still working on. And of course, we had some recent cases from the United States Supreme Court, particularly Rahimi, as well as a few other issues that have come down since then that are going to potentially impact how some of our cases that are currently pending are how they proceed forward here in the lower courts as well as in the Ninth Circuit. So just make sure that you're subscribed to the CRPA for any litigation updates along those lines. And we'll, of course, send out any updates that are directly impacting FFLGuard clients to you guys through FFLGuard as well. So with that, I don't have anything else unless anyone has any questions. It looks like there is one in the chat. Let me see this real quick. So the question is regarding incorporating the tax into the sales price. How would this work for out-of-state manufacturers who are relying on the in-state California retailers to collect and pay the tax? Well, that's generally pretty simple as far as what the CDTFA has posted and as far as how the tax actually gets collected. The burden on collecting the tax comes from the actual in-state retailer that processes the sale. So let's say if we're talking about a gun broker auction or something like that, where the out-of-state retailer simply delivers the gun to a California retailer for delivery to the customer, the tax will be collected by the in-state retailer. But what they're going to base that tax off of is, of course, going to be the retail price or the sales price of the contract or the fair market value of the firearm in question. So depending on whether or not there's going to be actually a receipt involved or something like that, where a person here in California purchases a firearm from out of state, if there's no receipt, it's going to be the burden of the vendor to pay the tax as far as the fair market value is concerned. And so that's something that you're going to have to figure out how to incorporate. And ultimately the in-state vendor here is going to actually have to collect that, and then also, of course, transfer that to the CDTFA as part of the collecting the tax. So if that answers your question.
I have a question. What about for instance, of drop ship? So the California retailer has sold something on their website, say that they don't possess in the store, and the wholesaler is going to drop ship it directly to the customer. What happens then?
So as far as when we're talking about firearms or ammunition, generally speaking, in California, all have to be processed through a licensed vendor here in the state of California.
No, but I'm just saying it wouldn't apply if they were drop shipping it out of the state then, or does it go against their gross sales? You see what I'm saying?
So just to clarify, if you're talking about like an in-state retailer here in California sending something to another state?
No, so what a lot of California retailers have websites, and on those websites, they sell all the firearms, right? They just don't, and there are wholesalers that drop ship firearms, right? But it never comes to them. The firearm never actually comes to the FFL. It is just sold online and shipped directly to the FFL where the customer lives. And that happens all the time.
Well, but where does the customer live? Does the customer live in California, or does
no, I meant, right. The customer lives somewhere outside of California.
Okay, so ultimately the end customer in this scenario, if they're outside of California, that's going to be subject to the sales tax of the state where that customer resides. So that sales tax here is not something that's going to necessarily apply in that situation, because that's where the retail sale is ultimately taking place by that customer that lives outside of California. So if it's shipped outside of California, it's not something that's going to be subject to the tax here in California.
What about their gross receipts then? Do they, as far as counting it, they have to exclude that sale from their gross receipts?
So yeah, generally, yes. It's not going to be something that if ultimately the end purchaser is outside of California, the sales tax and the excise tax in this case would not be collected by California. It would be whatever the state is in which the customer resides that ordered that particular item.
Right, but in calculating their gross receipts, they would exclude that sale.
Yes,
okay,
it wouldn't be subject to the tax, so they wouldn't have to pay the tax for that particular sale. Correct.
Thank you.
Matt, question for you. You described fair market value. Is there a definition of how a retailer is to derive fair market value?
Nope. Just do your best. So that's something that, again, is something that hasn't been specifically laid out, at least as far as the CDTFA or otherwise. I'm just double checking here to see if they have any.
Assuming they don't have anything, what do you feel would pass muster to meet scrutiny? Would it be to look at an average of gun broker sales values or something like that?
Most likely. Yeah, they're asking specifically the language that they're looking for, at least according to the CDTFA, is the fair retail selling price. So whatever that particular item normally retails for, if you can say, you could point to something that shows that, whatever that amount would be, in theory, that should be enough. There's nothing that, beyond that, from what I've seen, that the CDTFA has said, this is how you calculate that. So.
Right.
And should you document that? In other words, because obviously fair market value changes. So you need to document it where you got it from the day you got it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
What would you, and just to follow on that, to be thorough, what would you consider to be the burden of proof? Three separate transactions, 5 transactions? What would you feel would make muster?
Personally, I think if you could point to something that shows that this is a retail selling price of this particular, we're talking about firearms or ammunition. So obviously, in the case of firearms, I think it's probably going to be pretty easy where if you can point to the manufacturer's website and this says this is what the MSRP is, you're probably going to be fine in that regard. Ammunition might be a little bit more difficult depending on, if you can find a retail selling price of that particular ammunition. But again, there's no specific amount that I would say is sufficient. Everyone's gonna have to sort of use their best judgment depending on the particular item in question here.
That's kind of my point. If a consumer is not going to want a retailer to use MSRP, because that can oftentimes be double the fair market value of a firearm, and so now they're paying 11% on twice the price. So that's why I was kind of bringing that question up.
Well, so in that case, though, I mean, if you have a consumer that purchased something from out of state, if you can show the actual receipt for that particular item, what they purchased, that's going to be fine. Because what we're talking about here is if there's no receipt to base that off of. And so if the customer can show that this is what I paid for this particular item when I purchased it from out of state, that's what you can base the sales tax off of. And
but if it comes across the border as a $0, there was no money transacted. It was all done via some other means that diminished the visibility. That's the kind of the point I'm getting at, where it was like,
yes, yeah. But in that case, I mean, that in reality, then that situation, the burden falls on the purchaser there to show otherwise. Otherwise, you're going to have to say, well, if you can't give me a receipt, I'm going to have to base it off of what is going to be the fair retail price. And so at that point, you can, as part of your policies and procedures that you guys set, you can advise your potential retail clients ahead of time. If you have a written policy that makes clear, this is how we process these transactions from out of state. And if you don't like it, I mean, that's our policy, unfortunately. And so make sure to give us a receipt, which we can base the tax off of. Otherwise, we're going to have to use, like I said, the fair retail price, which we're going to point to the manufacturer's website first, probably. And if not, then we'll see what we can find. But unfortunately, that's what the CDTFA requires. So
there's a great website, truegunvalue.com. It divides the sales you can divide it, I believe, by geography as well as new and used sales. So you can really get a good snapshot of a fair market value for where you are. And that's truegunvalue.com.
Okay. So that's all I have. I'll turn it over to Josh. If you want to add anything to that, and if you got anything else you want to share to the group?
No, I think that's enough regulatory burden on the tax side, but I have more regulatory burden to discuss with you guys, and this is on the employment side. Hopefully, I'm not talking to anybody who is surprised by this particular burden that essentially took effect this month, July 1st, and that's the Workplace Violence Prevention Plan requirement that was ushered in by Senate Bill 553. I'm going to put a link here on the screen that has details about that. But essentially what happened was that in 2021, at a San Jose transit yard, an employee came in and shot some of his coworkers. I believe 9 were killed. And as the sins of the father are visited upon the son, so are the sins of public employers visited upon you folks, private employers, because now everybody needs to have a workplace violence prevention plan, and it is fairly rigorous and requires a significant amount of implementation and ongoing execution in order to be in compliance. So what your plan has to include is a policy for prohibiting employee retaliation for reporting suspected or actual incidents of employee violence or potential employee violence, a method for accepting those reports of potential or actual workplace violence. It requires a significant amount of training of employees and a identification of sort of channels of communication for both the training and the reporting. An emergency response plan. So when there is workplace violence, there's actually a plan in place for how employees are supposed to deal with it. And it requires you to go around and assess hazards, such as, and this would be germane to firearms retailers, what I would call soft points in the office or in the store. And then finally, there's lots of records and logs you have to keep. And again, this all became effective July 1. So hopefully I'm boring you by talking about, well, I'll bore you whether you knew about this or not. But hopefully you guys were well along the way of being in compliance before the beginning of the month. So I put a link up there that describes with detail what the workplace violence prevention plan law requires. I'm going to put up a copy of a model plan that you guys can look at, that was put out by the Department of Industrial Relations, OSHA, a couple months ago. And that gives you the sort of example of the things that you need to cover. By the way, I would presume that most, maybe not all, but most folks on here are going to be not exempt from this law. You're only exempt if your business, which is accessible to the public, has less than 10 employees total at that site. So if you have remote employees, but then you have less than 10 total employees that work out of a, let's say, a warehouse or a retail store, then you don't have to implement this. But if you have more than 10 employees working in your shop, then you have to comply with this law and implement your plan. So the plan is fairly rigorous. I'm going to go over some of the requirements, but again, this isn't something that I would expect any of you to listen to what I say, write it down, and then implement it. It requires a significant amount of understanding and research, and that's why I put the links up. But I'll go over some of the requirements so you understand the breadth of the law and understand what your obligation is. So when you put together the plan itself, and that's the link that the second link that I put up, you have to include things in it such as the names of the people responsible for implementing it, procedures for employees being involved in implementing the plan. And if you are in a sort of place where there are nearby employers, if you need to coordinate implementation or execution of the plan with, like, let's say, neighboring businesses, in a mass shooting event, then there needs to be methods for doing that in the plan. There needs to be methods for handling and responding to workplace violence, methods for ensuring that employees, particularly the supervisors, are complying with the plan. And then there needs to be procedures for communicating the plan to employees. And in fact, there's a pretty significant training requirement, essentially training by July 1st of this year, as well as annual training thereafter, similar to what we see with the sexual harassment training. And then there has to be procedures in place for reviewing and updating the plan, and both on a regular basis and also when there are specific incidents where the plan is triggered, such as, and I think probably what's more likely than a mass shooting is an employee has an issue with a partner or a family member, and they go out and they have to get a restraining order. And then suddenly, potentially, there's an issue that their domestic situation could spill over to the store because the person against whom they have a restraining order decides to come into the store to speak with them or do whatever. And at that point, that would be a situation where your workplace violence prevention plan would be in full effect. So now, in terms of the record keeping you have to do, that's pretty significant. In addition to setting up the plan, there are several logs that you need to create and maintain, and there's also records you need to maintain for each incident that happens. First, you need a log that identifies any workplace violence hazards that exist currently, and what method was used to correct those. And in the context of retail firearm sales, that would most likely be things such as employee safety as to contact with the public, whether or not members of the public could easily get behind the counter to the employees. I presume most of you aren't going to have that sort of exposure or weakness, but nonetheless, the plan requires you go around and identify if there are those weaknesses, and then you must log that you spotted these weaknesses and what steps you took to correct them. The training that you're required to do, training all your employees on what your workplace prevention policy is, what they're supposed to do in the event of a mass shooting issue or a domestic issue or any type of customer violence. You have to keep those training records for up to a year. And then you have to keep logs of every violent incident that occurs, whether that's, domestic situation, whether it's a customer issue. You have to keep those logs for 5 years. And additionally, you're required to investigate. And when you investigate, you have to keep those investigation records for 5 years. Additionally, if OSHA comes in and investigates, you have to keep those records for 5 years, but you had to keep the OSHA records anyway. So that's not much of a change. But this is all very significant. You absolutely have to report any workplace violence incidents to OSHA. And if you fail to make those reports to OSHA, or you fail to keep the records or implement the plan or train your employees or anything, you're going to be subject to civil penalties. Those have not been set yet, even though you guys are required to have complied with the law by the beginning of this month. OSHA has not put out regs with regard to what those penalties will be. The other mechanism or the other liability here is that these are potentially enforceable through PAGA lawsuits by employees, similar to other workplace condition claims, although PAGA is now getting reformed a little bit. So the onerousness of a PAGA lawsuit is hopefully not going to be as much as existed in the past. There's going to be some cure provisions and things like that in the new version of PAGA that will be taking effect likely at the beginning of next year. But there is sort of a 6-month window where there's potential PAGA liability. So I would encourage you, if you're one of the unlucky few who hasn't been aware of or hasn't implemented your workplace violence prevention plan, that you take a look at the links that I sent you and you get working on it. There are outside services that will help you put together your plan if you're not comfortable with it. But because it is fairly rigorous and significant, but you will obviously have to be involved in the process, for purposes of training and enforcement and keeping the logs and everything. So I don't know how helpful or effective it would be to hire one of those outside services to help you with your plan. I think you're probably better off either yourselves or one of your managers really diving into this and figuring out what you needed to have done and what you need to do. And doing it going forward. So the great state of California, as always, if they're not getting you coming, they're getting you going. And in this instance, between Matt's discussion of the excise tax and this latest burden of workplace violence prevention bureaucracy, they're getting you both ways. So that's all I have for this week.
Thanks, Josh and Matt. We do appreciate y'all giving us that information. Alexis, do you want to go next?
Sure. Just a little reminder that there is a new 3310.12 form for reporting multiple rifle sales, and that starting October the 1st, not only will O1s and O2s have to report multiple sales of certain rifles, O7s and O8s will as well. So there's already the new form is available on ATF's website. However, it is just you aren't required to start reporting until October 1st. We do recommend switching over to the new form as soon as possible. Another thing to keep in mind, like we talked about other times, is now is a great time in your downtime to do your inventories. During the summer, when things may slow down a little bit, you're paying your employees, you've got to get your inventories done. We've had several clients recently who've been inspected by ATF, and they've had missing firearms. The last way you want to find that out is by ATF being there and doing an inspection. You should be way ahead of that, and know that not just because ATF comes in to audit. Another thing to consider right now is it's time to get your disaster plan together. You know, we have resources available, but you can't wait till the disaster happens to start to react. You've got to have things in place so that when it occurs, you can keep moving forward. And there's a lot of things you really need to consider. You know, whether that's your credit card company drops you one day, or your internet service provider, or, you know, the place next door caught on fire, but they soaked your building as well, and you've got all these records that are wet. And to include, you know, maybe somebody tried to break in and damaged your building in the process. What do you do? And so it's really important that you have that thought through and have a plan going forward so that you can keep operating and, you know, keep the gun secure, all of the things that are still required, whether the sales are going out the door or not. So again, we'll have some resources available on the website as far as disaster preparedness goes. But again, during the summer, during those moments when maybe the foot traffic isn't as high in the store, that's a great time to stop and do those routine things that you need for maintenance of your store. So, you know, great time to redo training, great time for inventories, and if you don't have one, to start that disaster planning.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks, Alexis. All right, Hank, you're going to wrap us up for today. How about give us some good information?
You talking to me?
Yeah, you.
Hey, it's good to be here with everyone today. One thing I do want to jump on really quick, talking about the excise tax piece, and this is just from personal experience. Make sure you do a complete walkthrough with your point of sale provider on how that's going to be reported in your system. I went through a situation with a point of sale provider many years ago where it was double reporting my sales tax figure based on how it was back calculating it through the system, and I was way overpaying on sales tax. You know, go through and have them walk you through how it's calculating that report in your system as to what you owe for your excise piece. I'm assuming that they've bolted it into there for you guys, including things like layaways. Mine was that's where part of the double reporting was coming into layaways, where every time someone made a installment, it was recalculating the sales tax and piling it on instead of just looking at it from that percentage of what they were putting on to the purchase price. So I can't say enough, get with your point of sale provider and have them walk you through how is it calculating it in these different scenarios to make sure that it's being reported accurately and properly, because you don't want to have this big surprise that it was, you know, underreported for sure, overreported great, but then you got to go through this arduous journey of trying to, you know, prove that you overpaid and get your money back, which is probably not going to happen with California government. So make sure that everything is buttoned up nice and tidy from that perspective, if you're depending on your point of sale system to do the reporting for you on that piece. And then getting back to Alexis's, you know, commentary on doing audits and all that, where I can already see it in the retail numbers. The rubber band is in full snap right now, where all of that run-up sales before July 1, we're seeing a pullback in sales already. So use that downtime for all sorts of things to get your business tidied back up. You know, all that huge volume of sales, I'm sure for some shops out there, had them, you know, pushed to their limits as to how much business they could manage on a daily basis. That's when mistakes start creeping into a business. So use this sort of slow down time to take a breath and go into your systems and make sure everything was conducted properly, paperwork's all done properly, audits are done properly, all that kind of stuff. It's a gift in a way to have this ability to breathe for a little bit right now with sales pulling back, and get your ship straight again from that perspective. We'll see where sales are going to go from here. I've often always said that our industry always just, when we see surges, buys into the future. So, you know, is this going to see us a protracted slowdown period of time? All I can say, if you want to use my expertise of looking at 20 years worth of data in this industry, if you look at how much spike in business you had in the month of I would say for sure June, running up to July 1, look at that surplus of revenue that you generated as being what's going to be your slowdown. And until you see that X number of dollars of slowdown compensate for the X number of dollars in surplus that you had in June, until you hit those in even that curve out, you'll still be sort of in a slowdown period. So depending on what your store is, your store's climate and environment, and how this election plays into it, that's what my expectation, or that's how I would be counseling you if you're one of my clients, would be to say, expect an equitable slowdown to whatever your surplus was prior. But again, get out there, focus on sales, focus on playing some cleanup here after that, get your ship straight, and focus on compliance, standard operating procedures, and interrogate your point of sale provider to make sure that it's being calculated accurately and properly if you're leaning on your point of sale system to generate your excise tax figures for your reporting.
Thanks, Hank. We do appreciate everyone logging on today and being with us for this. And our next call will be on September the 16th, and we look forward to seeing you then. Alexis, do you know what booth number Chris and Brian will be in next week?
Not yet, but this week, yes. But Brian and Chris will be at the Range and Retailer Expo, so definitely stop by and see them. They'll be in a booth with Fastbound.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, everybody have a great day. And
it's booth 324. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason. All right, guys, y'all have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.